All right. I think that we can get started now that it's 12:04. So hello everyone and welcome to today's Community Grants information session for Humanities DC for our 2026 grants. Thank you all again so much for being here today. This meeting, as you can see, is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be sent out to you shortly, and they will also be available on our website shortly. If you would like captions during this presentation, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see an ellipses, and you should be able to access captions that way. There will be a Q&A baked into the presentation at the end, but if you do have questions throughout, feel free to just interrupt us, raise your hand, and we also have the chat feature if you want to type anything in as well. Next slide, please. So my name is Hillary Steen, and I am one of the community grants managers at HumanitiesDC. I am the primary contact for certain grants, but ultimately it's Leah and I who will be your main points of contact throughout this entire process. I am also the point person on staff who manages the reviewer outreach and reviewer stage, and we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So Leah, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure, thanks, Hillary. My name is Leah Gage, and I am the other community grants manager. I am a main point of contact for anything grant applicant related, and you can always reach out to me for anything regarding grants. But for grantees, I'm the main point of contact for Beyond the Archives grants, community culture and heritage, and general operating support. Thanks for being here.
And Loy, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Loy Nemard, and I oversee our grant making and public programs. Thanks for your interest in our grants.
And the fourth member of the grants team is Jasper Collier, and he is the senior manager for the DC Oral History Collaborative, which is one of our main aspects of our organization. If any of you become an oral history grantee, then you would work with him very closely. And so the four of us make up the grants team. And so now we want to turn the cameras over to you all for a bit to let us know who you are, what brought you here today. If you have the beginnings of an idea for a project, feel free to talk about that too. We have a good group of people here, so we might not be able to get through everyone, but if anyone would like to jumpstart and get us started. And you're more than welcome to type into the chat if you prefer.
Hillary, this is Dr. Maya. Do you mind repeating your request? I did not hear everything that you just requested.
Oh, sure. So now we're just curious to see who's in the room. If anyone wants to introduce themselves, you can talk a little bit about what brought you here today. If you have ideas for a project, you can talk briefly about that. We have a good group of people in the Zoom room today, so we might not have time to go through everyone, but if anyone would like to introduce themselves, you're welcome to just start talking or type it into the chat.
Hi,
Hi, everyone. Oh, go ahead.
Dr. Maya, please be my guest.
I'm Dr. Maya Cunningham. I'm a professor at American University and a community and cultural activist and ethnomusicologist. And I'm very interested in the grant program. And we're interested in doing a collaborative Black music symposium, and then possibly also an oral history project of a particular cultural arts center that used to exist in Adams Morgan.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandy Holloway. Yeah, I'm here, I think just for general information. I am an artist, activist. I have history in social change work. I'm a director. I'm also a choreographer. I'm also a facilitator. There are a number of projects that I have. Okay, not a number. a few projects that I have that I'm interested in doing. I also at some point attended a training session on oral history from DC Humanities. So a lot of projects are coming together for me right now. I am not exactly sure which one I'm leading with, so I thought I should join today and get a lot more information. I've also been the director and facilitator for a program in DC called City at Peace. And other than City at Peace, I'm also directing and choreographing for theaters inside and outside of DC. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jim Schulman. I'm an architect registered here in DC and Maryland, but I also run a small nonprofit called the Alliance for Regional Cooperation, or ARC. And last year, ARC applied, along with many community members in the Brooklyn neighborhood, for a HumanitiesDC grant to do a community visioning project. We didn't get selected, but I'm continuing to hear interest from residents of Brooklyn that they want to move forward to help use the arts and humanities to revision their future. And I would be excited to move this along, but we absolutely need funding to make that possible. So it's also conceivable that ARC could apply to do similar kinds of work in other DC neighborhoods, but since we did the groundwork last year to get significant community and organizational support, I think it's most likely that we'll move forward with Brookland. Check.
Welcome. Maybe we have time for one more person if anyone wants to present. But if not, that is totally okay too. The chat will continue to be available if people would like to introduce themselves later on.
Okay, everyone, can you all see my screen again? Hillary, can you confirm? Okay, thank you so much. So the next thing we want to talk about is, what are the humanities? We are the Humanities Council. We give grants for public humanities work, but it's often a concept that isn't grasped by everybody. And it's something that touches us all, but we may not all know exactly what the humanities are. So does anybody here have a definition they're willing to share? And again, you may unmute yourself and share verbally, or you can drop it in the chat. That's okay. If you feel like you want to share any thoughts as we talk about this, please feel free. But something that I look to when I want to define the humanities is just the first part of that word, human. And really just understanding that the humanities are about telling human stories and using human stories to help us understand what's going on currently in our present, what used to happen, what our history is in the past, and what we could see in the future. The humanities help us learn from history and literature. They help us empathize with one another through language and comparative religion, and challenge our assumptions with philosophy and ethics. These are just a few of the disciplines that fall into the humanities, and we invite you to take a look at this definition as you're thinking about a humanities project to make sure that it really does fit into the public humanities. We also have a link to the National Endowment for Humanities definition of the humanities. One question we receive sometimes is, are the humanities the same as the arts, or are the humanities the arts? The arts are definitely a way to communicate human stories. The arts are often a way that human stories are expressed. And so art projects or art-related work can fall into a project that is funded by HumanitiesDC. However, what I would encourage you to think about is that a humanities project offers interpretation with it. So we don't fund art for art's sake, but if artists want to put together a project that explores community stories, that looks at history, or if artists want to organize collectively, perhaps to do a study of their own history, the history of an art movement, those are ways that artists can often get involved with the humanities. So at HumanitiesDC, what we do is we offer grants as well as our own public programming to help get DC residents and visitors involved in our humanities community. And so, like I said, we have our own public programming, such as our community journalism program, a program that invites DC residents to write their own community stories and help them get published in DC publications. We have the DC Oral History Collaborative, which Hillary mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about more. We have some fellowships here at our own office, as well as independent practitioner fellowships. And then we have our community grants. And this year we expect to award about $900,000 to 50 plus grantees across all 8 wards. We have 6 categories of grants, and we expect to award about 10 grants, 10 to 15 in each category. And so these are the current grants that are on offer. We have our Community Culture and Heritage Grant. We have the DC Oral History Interviewing Grant, and we have the Visions Grant. And right now I'm going to take a second to just show you our grant opportunities page, because this will give an overview of the grants that we have. So let me pull this in. So this is our grant opportunities webpage. And if you scroll here, you can see the open grant opportunities. Our Community Culture and Heritage Grant is available. That's a $10,000 grant. That is open to individuals as well as organizations. The Visions Grant, and that's a projects and events grant that's open for $25,000. And that is open to nonprofit organizations. And then our DC Oral History Collaborative Grant, and that's an $8,000 to $13,000 grant open to individuals as well as organizations. Those are the 3 grants that are currently available. We will offer 3 additional grants at the end of, or rather in March, starting March 3rd. And so those are linked here, and you can read more about them on this webpage. That's the DC Oral History Collaborative Beyond the Archives grant, our Continuing Oral History Projects grant, and our General Operating Support grant. So we will go into each one of those grant opportunities and explain in more detail. But I wanted to take this opportunity to just show you this webpage, because there's a lot of key information that is available here. We'll go into all of this, but when you've ended this presentation and you want to come back, you can see here on this page, we have all of our different applicant support opportunities, including upcoming information sessions, a link to virtual office hours with one of our staff, an offer for draft review of your application, as well as some sample exemplary application responses. So I just wanted to show you that before we go into great detail in the different grant programs. Okay, so let's go on to DC Oral History Collaborative grants.
So we have said DC Oral History Collaborative a few times in this presentation, and if you have known about HumanitiesDC, you've probably heard us talk about DCOHC before. So now it's time to actually explain it. So oral history interviews are special interviews that ask about people's life story. So instead of a narrow series of questions like what you might find in journalism, oral history interviews are how someone's life might intersect with historical events, and it adds perspective to the historical record. So the DC Oral History Collaborative is a partnership we have with the DC Public Library, all about this, and it allows Washingtonians to get training on oral history interviewing. We also provide grant making, as well as public projects all about oral history interviews as well. And in 2026, we will have 3 DCOHC grant opportunities that fall under that DCOHC umbrella: oral history interviewing, beyond the archives, and continuing oral history projects. So we can start diving into these. So the first one is oral history interviewing, which is now open since it's in cycle 1. And this grant provides funding to collect and archive oral history interviews. And so these are projects that explore DC life, history, and culture through these interviews with people who have lived it. This grant is open to DC-based individuals, community groups, and 501c3 nonprofits. And grantees can receive up to $8,000 to collect and archive these interviews. However, you are also more than welcome to request an additional $5,000 to translate transcripts into different languages. And this kind of, you can go back, thank you. This grant requires several deliverables, which would allow each interview to be archived at the DC Public Library. And these deliverables include media files, transcripts, indexes, release forms, and metadata for each interview. And if all of that doesn't make any sense, that's totally okay. Most applicants and grantees have actually never done an oral history project until they receive funding from us. And at the very beginning of the grant period, which would be in like early to mid-May, we provide a 3-session in-person training all about how to conduct oral history interviews and how to complete the deliverables as well. And we would work with you every step of the way. The project period for this grant starts on May 1st of 2026 through January 31st of 2027. And in this case, this means that all funding must be spent between those 2 time periods. The applications for this particular grant close on February 18th at 6 p.m. And if you do have any questions about this particular grant, I am your main point of contact. And at the very bottom of the slide here is the link to the RFP, which stands for Request for Proposal, which is a document that's about 10 to 15 pages long that goes into detail about the grant. So it talks about eligibility criteria, reporting requirements, ways to start thinking about your project, things like that. And all RFPs are available on our website. And again, it is linked below here. And so 2 examples of current OHI grantees. One is Khadijah Wilson, who is an artist and filmmaker who is gathering oral histories of those who've moved through the foster care system as children growing up in DC. Another example is with Linda Kuo, who's an advocate and an artist who is collecting oral histories from key team members from an organization called Domestic Violence Resource Project. And these interviews ask people about their work and their impact over the past few decades through this organization. So that's one example of a grant. Another example of a grant is the Continuing Oral History Projects grant, which is not open just yet. It will be open in cycle 2. And it is very similar to OHI. So you could still receive up to $8,000 with the additional $5,000 to translate transcripts. It is still funding to collect and archive oral history interviews. However, this grant is only available for people or organizations who have already completed an oral history project with HumanitiesDC. So it is only for these previous grantees who want to collect and archive more interviews to continue their project. The project period for this one starts on July 1st of 2026 and goes through March 31st of 2027. So since it's cycle 2, it starts later. But again, during this project period, that's when you have to spend all of the funds that you receive. Applications for this one open on March 3rd, and the deadline for these applications is May 1st of 2026. And I will be your main point of contact for this grant as well. And so one example of a current grantee under this grant program is Charvis Campbell, and he is a music historian and a local record store owner who is continuing a project that he started back in 2022. And this project documents oral histories from a program called Westminster Jazz and Blues, which has been a long-standing jazz and blues program at the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Southwest DC.
Okay, so the third grant program that's part of the DC Oral History Collaborative Grants is called Beyond the Archives. We'll offer this in the second cycle this year. So this grant is open to DC-based individuals, community groups, and nonprofit organizations with a maximum award amount of $12,000. The intent behind this grant program is to take oral histories that have been recorded and that exist in some archive. That could be the People's Archive at the DC Public Library, or it could be a separate archive that an organization has. It could be your own personal family archive. But the goal being to take these oral histories and present them in some public forum, utilizing them to illustrate something, some story, or use them to tell a story either about community or history, but that they are taken out of the archives and presented publicly. So the project period for this grant would be from July 1st, 2026 to April 30th, 2027, meaning that the funds would need to be spent within that period and that the project would need to take place within that period. So examples, like I said, those could be exhibitions, performances. We've had folks set up exhibits that utilize listening stations where people can listen to oral histories that have been gathered. Course curricula that use oral histories. So these are just some examples. Applications for this grant program will open March 3rd, 2026, and submissions will be due May 1st, 2026. The RFP is not currently available. That will become available March 3rd. And once this grant program opens and the grant program is funded, I'm the main point of contact. A couple of examples of past Beyond the Archives grants. One is from Eileen Dougherty. She's a filmmaker in Capitol Hill who collected a bunch of oral histories independently during COVID and throughout 2020 and 2021. Now she's taking those oral histories and using them to create a documentary called Voices of Resilience that's talking about the neighborhood during the period of COVID, but also following the January 6th insurrection. Another project that we recently funded is called Faces of Aging, Hear Their Stories. Years ago, we gave an oral history collection grant to the Cleveland and Woodley Park Village. They collected oral histories from their residents at the village, and then later received a grant for the Beyond the Archives program to take those oral histories and present them at an exhibit at the Cleveland Public Library. You can see here outside, they had large photos and quotes of each of the residents who had collected their oral histories. It was a really exciting event, and these are just a couple of examples of ways DC residents and orgs have taken oral histories and created public programs with them. We are currently now offering the Community Culture and Heritage Grant. So this is another grant that we offer. This is also open to DC-based individuals, community groups, and nonprofits. The maximum award amount for this grant is $10,000. And the goal behind this grant is to really just fund general projects that are focused on public humanities, interpretations of DC history, of culture, for local historians or individual humanists, as well as nonprofit organizations who want to capture and preserve their culture and narratives. And so examples of that could look like panel discussions, multimedia projects or websites, educational materials or curriculum, lesson plans, walking tours, things like that. The project period takes place from May 1st, 2026 through April 30th, 2027. And grantees in this program take part in a public showcase in April of 2027. This is a showcase that takes the work, it's something that HumanitiesDC puts on, and it takes the work of all of our community, culture, and heritage grantees and puts it on display for the public. There's a portion of the event where grantees have tables where folks can walk through and talk to them about their projects, and then give a public presentation in the kind of theater format. This coming year, our event will take place at the ARC on April 9th. And it's a really exciting event, and it's a perk of this grant because it gives a platform to humanists to present their work to other folks who may not have already known about it. So like I said, this grant is currently on offer, and applications close February 18th, 2026 by 6 p.m. Once this grant is funded, I'm the main point of contact, and the link to the RFP is here. A couple of examples. This past year, we gave a grant to Tracy Childs McGee, who funded, or who rather put on the project Salon Redux. This was in the spirit of of poet and playwright Georgia Douglas Johnson, who had a historic S Street salon in the early 20th century. So she basically created a toolkit, a digital toolkit that other folks could use to host their own salons in that history. And so that's currently available. You can go online to Tracy's website and find that toolkit. It's a really cool project, but it also kind of is rooted in this DC history of the salon history of Black thought leaders in the early 20th century in DC. And then filmmaker Valeria Massarelli Cersante, she got a grant to do a short film about immigrant food culture in DC called District of Pupusas. And so she has collected interviews and footage that document this project. So those are a couple community culture and heritage examples. And lastly, visions. No, not lastly. Second to last.
Second to last. So Visions is another example of a grant that is open right now, and it is to fund public-facing projects that connect to humanities scholarship, research, knowledge, and ideas through public interpretations of the humanities, which may include documentaries, festivals, conferences, curricula, exhibits, and more. And Visions is very similar to Community Culture and Heritage, CCH, that Leah just talked about. But there are a few key differences between the two. The first one is that CCH primarily focuses on grassroots, hyperlocal projects, whereas for Visions, you can look at a broader approach, maybe a larger scale project. So this kind of funding might help fund feature-length documentary films, several day-long festivals, things like that. And so if you are trying to decide which grant you want to apply to, Visions or CCH, just keep that scope in mind. And Leah and I are always available to answer questions about any of the grants, including if you're unsure which grant makes more sense for your project. Visions is open to DC-based nonprofit organizations. So this is another key difference between Visions and CCH, that this particular grant is only open to 501c3 nonprofits. If you are an individual or an informal group that does not have 501c3 status, you must apply through a fiscal sponsor. And we'll talk about fiscal sponsors later in the presentation. The maximum award amount for Visions grantees is $25,000. And yes, you are allowed to request the full $25,000. The project period for this grant is from May 1st of 2026 through April 30th of 2027. So during this time period, this is when all of your activities happen and all of the funds are spent. Applications for this grant, since it's for cycle 1, close on February 18th, 2026, and I am your main point of contact for Visions projects and questions. And two examples of current Visions grantees. One is the DC Zine Fest, and they were able to receive a grant to host their DC Zine Fest Community Festival, which brought together local creators to share their work and host workshops to examine zine making culture and impact all over the city. And another example of a grantee is One World Education. And they received a grant to help fund their One World Academy, which is an after school program for middle school students in DC public schools to teach them about college level writing, advocacy, and public speaking on various important topics.
And Hillary, before we move on, I just want to highlight a question. Abby asked if we could reiterate the difference of scale between CCH and Visions again.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So with CCH, you can receive up to $10,000 for your project. And CCH projects are typically more hyperlocal, smaller scale, hyper local projects. So it might be like if you have an idea for your particular neighborhood or your particular block or a small community in DC, maybe you want to do a series of like short panel discussions or a documentary short, things like that. Like the smaller scale of projects, that's for CCH. And also for CCH, that is open to individuals or 501c3 nonprofits. Whereas for Visions, it is only available for nonprofit organizations that are registered in DC with 501c3 status. They can receive up to $25,000 for their project. And these are typically like broader scale, larger projects. So it might be feature length documentary films, festivals that take place over several days, exhibits that might be a little more complex. Maybe they're up for several months, things like that. But if you have a particular idea and you're not sure which one to apply to, we can definitely chat offline about your particular idea too.
The other thing I'll say about community culture and heritage is that the intent is that that be a project that is completed within the grant period, and thus able to be presented as part of the community showcase. So those projects are smaller in scope because a documentary film probably can't be completed within the length of a year or less. But so that's another key difference between those two grant programs. So the last grant program to talk about today is our General Operating Support Grant. And that is going to be available in the second cycle. So that will open March 3rd. And this grant is open for humanities-focused nonprofit organizations. Their mission and track record needs to be rooted in public humanities work or the humanities, not necessarily public humanities, but humanities work, with annual budgets of less than $2 million. So in this case, a nonprofit needs to have an organization needs to have nonprofit status. An informal group would not be eligible to apply through a fiscal sponsor in this case. The grant maximum award amount is $25,000. And the purpose of this grant is really to shore up the vibrant humanities landscape in DC by providing general operating support funds, unrestricted funds to DC-based humanities nonprofits. Applicants need not propose a project, but rather can use these funds broadly for general operations for the nonprofit. And so the key behind the eligibility requirement here is that humanities focus as well as the size of the organization. And so we can talk either through office hours or we can talk here a little bit about what that means when we say humanities focused nonprofits. We ask that applicants in this category provide their mission statement, and so that we can look to see are there humanities aspects of the organization rooted in their mission statement, and is there a track record of programming that shows that the humanities, whether it's storytelling, whether it's documenting history, whether it's celebrating culture or preserving culture, that those are aspects that are key to the organization's existence. So the applications for this, like I said, will open March 3rd, 2026, and they will be due May 1st, 2026. And I'm the main point of contact for this grant. So 2 organizations who received this grant this past year, More Than Our Crimes. They're a nonprofit organization that engages with incarcerated populations. They're based here in DC. They provide publication opportunities as well as writing opportunities for incarcerated folks here in DC. And Turning the Page is a different nonprofit organization. They're a small nonprofit that supports DC families and parents with opportunities to help them take a more active role in their children's education, particularly through reading and literacy programming. All of the grantees that we talked about today are listed on our website, and you can look through and see all of the different grantees and their different projects if you go to the grants section of our website. So those are all of the 6 grant programs that we will offer this year. So now let's go a little bit more in detail on some of the requirements behind some of our grants.
So one of the requirements that is a requirement for 3 of the grant opportunities is someone called a humanities scholar. And this is someone who is knowledgeable about the proposed subject matter, who can inform the project's design, the implementation of the project, or the evaluation of the project. We define scholar very broadly, so it could be someone who does have formal academic training, so maybe they are a college professor, for example. Scholars can also have professional experience, so maybe they are a librarian or a researcher who works in this space, and or a scholar can have lived experience. So they would have experience maybe as a community historian, public humanities practitioner, they're a culture bearer, etc. And so maybe this person is someone who has lived on the block for 50 years. They know everyone who lives there. They could be considered a humanities scholar as well. And ultimately, the humanities scholar lends legitimacy or intellectual authority to the project. In some cases, it is possible that the project director is also the humanities scholar. So the project director is the person who is ultimately in charge of the actual implementation of the project. And perhaps their background and experience and expertise means that they could also be the scholar. So if you want to have the same person doing both, you would just explain that in the application.
So some notes on fiscal sponsorship. A couple of our grant opportunities allow for applicants to apply through fiscal sponsors, and some don't. The General Operating Support Grant is one that we don't allow fiscal sponsorship. But all the other grant opportunities can utilize fiscal sponsors. And so when we say fiscal sponsor, a fiscal sponsor is a nonprofit organization that takes on the legal and financial obligations for a grant. Oftentimes, informal groups who maybe have not yet received their nonprofit status, or individuals may want to work with a fiscal sponsor to take on some of those responsibilities of a grant. Fiscal sponsors will usually charge a bit of a fee to do that. And that is not something that HumanitiesDC gets involved with, other than to say a fiscal sponsor cannot be paid more than 10% of a given grant for such a fee. So taking all that into consideration, for HumanitiesDC, individuals requesting $13,000 or less are not required to apply through a fiscal sponsor. And that's why our Community Culture and Heritage Grant, as well as all of our DC Oral History Collaborative grants, are open to individuals. So individuals can apply. They don't need to have a 501c3 status. An informal community group could also apply. They would just need to identify one individual to serve as the primary grantee. The Visions grant, that's a $25,000 grant. So if an individual or an informal community group wants to access those funds, they would in that case need to work with a fiscal sponsor. And so we have a couple of fiscal sponsor nonprofits that we know who may be available to work with you. We don't make recommendations. We just can kind of let you know who they are, and you can make those relationships on your own. But we can provide some support there if that's of interest. All fiscal sponsors need to meet the same eligibility requirements as all of our grantees. So they need to be based here in Washington, D.C. They need to be 501c3 nonprofits. And if somebody is, say, based in Maryland or Virginia and wants to apply for a grant, using a fiscal sponsor is not, unfortunately, a way to get around that requirement. A fiscal sponsor couldn't, say, sponsor a Maryland-based individual to apply for one of our grants. So in those cases, you would need to maybe work with a DC-based individual to be the grantee or something like that.
And so we realized that we just threw out a lot of information at all of you. So here is a quick, non-comprehensive guide that focuses on different eligibility requirements and the kinds of projects that might be funded under each grant program. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this meeting is being recorded. You will all get the slides and the recording, but if you would like to take a photo of this, you're more than welcome to.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the RFP. This is the request for proposal, and this is the 10 to 15 page document that Hillary mentioned earlier. This is available on our website, and I recommend that you read this document if you wish to apply for one of our grants. This document will go into several key things that you need to know in order to apply. The first piece being applicant eligibility. We talked a lot about different eligibility requirements, and so when you read that RFP, that will give you all of those details. The funding scope will also be described in more detail in the RFP. So if you're curious about the type of project that's eligible, if you're not sure how to kind of shape a project, reading that funding scope and the details behind the grant program and its intentions will help you get there. The RFP also provides all of the weighted review criteria. So reviewers who review our applications, they use weighted review criteria that is available to you all as applicants to understand so that you know what reviewers will be scoring applications on. Hillary will talk a little bit more about what reviewers are and how that process works. But all of those review criteria are presented very clearly and transparently in the review or in the RFP. Eligibility requirements, like I said, that's all broken down in the RFP, as well as the note on submitting multiple applications. Briefly, I'll say that you can, in this current cycle, apply for 2 different grants if you wish. You can apply to the oral history interviewing grant, as well as the community culture and heritage grant or the visions grant. We want to encourage people to apply for the oral history grant, and so we allow folks to apply for that grant as well as one of the others. However, if you were to be accepted in both those grant programs, you would just need to choose which grant program. Applicants may only receive 1 program grant per year. Existing grantees can also apply for a grant this cycle, even if their current grant is open. All we ask is that current grantees have their grants closed out successfully with their final report submitted before any new funds would be distributed. The RFP talks about allowable costs. So certain grants will, like the general operating support is a broader grant. We can support the general operations, but for most other grants, they're project grants, and allowable expenses need to be tied to the project itself. There are certain things that we can never fund, such as food and beverage, things like that will all be noted specifically in the RFP. The RFP will also give details around ADA compliance requirements. Some organizations and some event organizers will be required to explain their ADA compliance records, but there will also be details around accessibility generally and how we define accessibility and provide equal opportunity for all applicants. The RFP will go into how to apply, It's an online process. We have an application that's linked on that website that I showed you earlier, as well as the post-application review process. The timeline for when payments would be received, grant award terms, and the process for closing out a grant. So all of those things will be available in the RFP for you to take a look at.
So speaking of the very last bullet that Leah said about the post-application process, I want to go into detail about what happens during this process after you actually submit your application. So all submitted applications are reviewed by me and Leah for something called eligibility. So this is when we would see if we can theoretically fund your project. So for example, if you're an organization that's applying, we would check your 501c3 registration at this stage. All eligible applications are then assigned to panels or groups of reviewers who would actually be the ones reviewing your application. And so these assignments are based on a few different factors. Essentially, we want reviewers to review applications that are similar to one another. So in years past, we've divided your applications by organizational budget size, by project output, by humanities discipline, things like that. And the actual reviewers are external community members who have strong ties to the humanities in DC. And these are the people who would actually essentially choose who the grantees are. So they score your application based off of the weighted review criteria that Leah mentioned earlier. And many applicants, grantees, and future applicants are also reviewers. You are more than welcome to apply for funding and be a grant reviewer. You would just not review applications for the same grant program that you actually apply to. And reviewers get a lot out of this experience. They learn about really cool projects and organizations around DC. They learn what makes a strong application because they're the ones who are actually scoring based on strength of applications. It's also a wonderful networking opportunity to meet other humanists in the area and more. And all reviewers who are able to complete their review cycle can receive a $125 honorarium as a thank you for volunteering for this important work. And so if you are interested in being a reviewer yourself, more information is on our website, which is linked here. And there is also a webpage on our website that is all about becoming a grant reviewer. So once the grant reviewers actually finish their review, then we at HumanitiesDC send to the board a memo which outlines the review process that we followed for that cycle. And we also give them the slate or the list of likely grantees. And so the board determines if we on staff followed the review process that we have to follow each cycle. So us on staff do not choose the grantees. The humanities board does not choose the grantees. It is really the reviewers who do it in the end. Funding decisions are sent out about 10 weeks after the application deadline happens, which I know in the nonprofit world is really fast, but we pride ourselves that we're able to move through this review period quickly, but also thoroughly. If you want to submit your own application way before the funding deadline, you're more than welcome to. Cycle 1 applications are open and you can submit your application right now if you would like. But just be aware that we won't tell you if you received funding or not until about 10 weeks after the actual application deadline. And if you are a brand new sparkly shiny grantee, then you can receive your funds about 2 weeks after you're told that you have received funding. And so if you are interested in being a reviewer, if you have further questions about the review process or anything like that, I am your main point of contact for this stage.
So, like I said, we have a lot of different applicant resources available. You can sign up for virtual office hours. We have a frequently asked question document as well as some sample application responses. We also offer draft review. So to have your review or your draft reviewed, just save it in the application and email one of us. All of the details for how to do that are listed on the website as well. Um, our emails are there, and we have some upcoming information sessions. We'll be at the Woodridge Public Library next month on January 8th, and we'll be at the Dorothy Height Public Library next month, January 13th, as well as another virtual session. And these sessions will go over all of our grants, but then we also offer 3 in-depth grant workshops: the Community Culture and Heritage Grant Workshop, Oral History Interviewing, and Visions. So those will also be next month. And those are really intended if you already know you want to apply to that grant program. Ideally, you've had a chance to look at the application and maybe even start it. And you can come ready with some specific questions about the application, about some of the eligibility requirements, etc. So those are coming up, and we hope that you can attend some of those. But yeah, this is now an opportunity for you all to ask some questions of us. So please, if you have a question and it hasn't been answered in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can drop it into the chat.
I have a question.
Great.
Samaya Lane, I do have a nonprofit, System Supports for Social Stability, and I'd like to know how do you assess our track record in the humanities? Do we submit our mission statement? Do we submit our bylaws and all of the legal workings of of our organization to you?
We ask that you would submit for the general operating support grant. We would ask that you submit the mission statement and then examples of past program work showing work in the humanities.
One more question. So right now, I have a project going. I'm an author of a children's book, but it's a storytelling book about how to reach children to build emotional intelligence and basically mental health for the child. So this is kind of the basis of this book. It's already published. Would that be an example of a humanities project?
Um, it could be. I think I would need to know a little bit more. I think I think if there were an aspect of the project focused on understanding the history of the mental health community around that issue, um, it could be. Uh, Especially if if you're going out into the community and doing youth literacy work, reading the story to folks,
Yeah.
making it available. We can definitely talk more about it.
Okay.
Maya, you're muted.
Thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing, making these grant funds accessible, easy to understand. It's really wonderful, and the work that you're supporting. And I'm from DC, and so I'm recently returned, so I'm very happy to see that this is moving forward in this way. Question about allowable expenses for the Visions grant. Are any general operating support funds or any general operating support budget lines allowable in that grant, or do the funds need to be totally focused on the event itself?
So if you have like staff costs related to the event, those could definitely be covered. You would just have to tie it back to the event. If you have space rental or office space or printing, things, you just, again, would tie it back to the project.
Okay, I'll probably sign up for an office hours to ask more specifics. because I'm trying to understand if we need to apply through the university, which has its own, as I'm sure you're familiar, uh, rules of how to receive grants and things like that, or do we need to work with one of our collaborators, uh, our community-based collaborators, and then they receive for this particular event that we have in mind. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we have funded different universities and colleges around DC, so we are definitely aware that universities have their own internal set of rules that we would work with you. So definitely feel free to sign up for office hours.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just thought of one more question. One of your grantees, Khadija Wilson, are they open to other people contacting them personally? Because I'm interested in her work that she did with interviewing children going through the foster care program. I would like to get her information to contact her.
Yeah, if you want to put your own email into the chat, I'm happy to send her your contact info.
Definitely.
And there were a few questions in the chat about if you have applied for funding in previous years, how you should approach for the current grant cycle. Um, and so ultimately, like they are two separate applications. We didn't change too much for any of the applications, at least in cycle one between last year and this year. So you can definitely look through your previous application, make whatever edits to resubmit. That is totally fine. It would be a different set of reviewers who would be reviewing your application this year. And I do recommend that if you did not receive funding previously, kind of take a look at why perhaps you weren't chosen for reviews previously. Um, if you haven't yet, you can definitely ask me and Leia to send you the reviewer comments from that previous application. So you can take a look at what the reviewers had to say about it as well. So if you wanted to do like an annual project or something, you applied in previous years, perhaps you weren't funded, you're still doing that project, you want to apply for new funding, that's totally okay if it's the same project that you are requesting funding for year by year.
Any other questions or ideas that came up? Okay. Well, as we've said, this session was recorded and we will make it available on our website and on our YouTube. And I'll make sure to email it out to everybody along with the slides so that you have it. But please be in touch with us, as we've said. If you have questions and would like to set up office hours, we would be happy to meet with you. But we really look forward to reviewing your applications and appreciate your time today. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a wonderful holiday season.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.